Imagine a sea strewn with the wreckage of warships across a distance that you could travel in a modern automobile in 4 hours. 364 Roman military vessels turned into floating coffins in one single night of 255 BCE. From this enormous armada off the shores of Sicily near the city of Camarina, only 80 ships survived. The historian Polybius, a contemporary of those events, called this catastrophe the greatest maritime tragedy in the history of humanity. And this was just one of many storms that during the First Punic War swallowed 700 Roman warships. Do you comprehend the scale of this tragedy? But how did it happen that the masters of land, the Romans, decided to challenge the maritime elements? The fact is that by the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome faced the necessity of fighting for Sicily against Carthage. The Carthaginian seafarers, whom the Romans called Punics, had dominated the maritime expanses for several centuries already. Their warships, equipped with powerful bronze rams, could develop speeds up to 8 knots and maneuver with such dexterity that Roman military commanders initially considered naval warfare impossible. However, fate decreed otherwise. In 264 BCE began the First Punic War, which stretched for 23 bloody years. The Romans, who had never possessed a serious fleet, built more than 1,000 warships in an incredibly short time. Archaeological findings confirm Polybius's words that Roman shipbuilders managed to copy a captured Carthaginian Penteri and within several months established mass production of military vessels. These ships, called quinqueremes, had 5 rows of oars and carried crews of up to 300 people on board. Can you imagine the thunder of 1,000 such giants plowing the waters of the Mediterranean? However, Roman ships had one fatal flaw. Unlike Carthaginian vessels, created by experienced seafarers, Roman quinqueremes possessed low seaworthiness and could not withstand sudden storms. Polybius directly indicates that the navigational illiteracy of the senior command staff of the Roman fleet became the main cause of future catastrophes. Roman admirals, accustomed to land battles, did not understand the treachery of the maritime elements. They did not know that Mediterranean storms could strike within minutes and turn a calm sea into a roaring abyss. And the lives of hundreds of thousands of people were at stake. The first successes of the Roman fleet seemed like a true miracle. In 260 BCE at Cape Mylae occurred the incredible. Land warriors defeated the best seafarers of the ancient world. How did this become possible? Roman engineers invented a revolutionary device that turned naval battle into a land fight right on the decks of ships. This mechanism was called corvus, an iron raven with a sharp beak. Imagine a movable bridge 11 meters long and 1.5 wide, which could rotate 180 degrees and crash down onto an enemy ship with terrible thunder. Polybius describes how the corvus pierced the deck of a Carthaginian vessel with its metal beak and locked the opponent's ships together to the death. And could you have climbed such a bridge under a hail of arrows and javelins? Consul Gaius Duilius, who commanded the Roman fleet at Mylae, turned his ships into floating fortresses. 143 Roman quinqueremes opposed 130 Carthaginian vessels, and the Romans achieved a crushing victory. Archaeological findings confirm Polybius's testimony that the Carthaginians lost 50 ships sunk and 13 captured in this battle. However, this triumph had its reverse side. The corvus weighed almost a ton and was located in the bow of the ship, which severely disrupted the vessel's balance. In heavy seas or with a sudden turn of the mechanism, the ship could dangerously list or even capsize. Roman admirals sacrificed seaworthiness for tactical advantage, and this fatal error would cost them dearly. After the victory at Mylae, the Romans felt themselves masters of the seas and decided to strike at the very heart of the Carthaginian state, Africa. In 256 BCE, consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso assembled a colossal armada of 330 warships. Titus Livius reports that on these vessels were 4 full legions, about 24,000 heavily armed warriors plus auxiliary troops. Each legionnaire carried equipment weighing up to 30 kilograms: lorica, a chainmail shirt; scutum, a large rectangular shield; gladius, a short sword; and 2 pila, throwing spears. Can you imagine what burden these wooden giants carried? But ahead of them awaited an even more grandiose trial, the greatest naval battle of antiquity at Cape Ignomus. Off the shores of Sicily, the Roman Armada met the Carthaginian fleet of 350 vessels under the command of Hamilcar and Hanno. Polybius describes in detail this grandiose spectacle. Almost 700 warships, carrying on board more than 140,000 people, converged in a deadly struggle over an area of several square kilometers. The Romans built their ships in the form of a triangle. In front went the consular hexers, behind them followed transports with horses and siege machines, and on the sides were positioned escorts of light vessels. Imagine this iron wedge cutting through sea waves to the sounds of thousands of oars and war trumpets. And would you have dared to stand in the front ranks of such an attack, knowing that ahead of you awaited collision with the most experienced warriors of the Mediterranean? The battle at Cape Ignomus became the greatest triumph of Roman arms at sea. Polybius described how Roman ships literally rammed through the Carthaginian formation, sinking 30 enemy vessels and capturing another 64. The Carthaginian admirals Hamilcar and Hanno, accustomed to easy victories over inexperienced opponents, did not expect such fierce resistance. Roman legionnaires turned the decks of captured vessels into real slaughterhouses, fighting with their short swords gladi in the cramped quarters of ship superstructures. Can you imagine this chaos among the wreckage of masts and bloodied sails, when victors and vanquished fought for every meter of deck planking? The road to Africa was open, and the Romans for the first time in history landed on the soil of their sworn enemies. Consul Marcus Atilius Regulus, remaining in Africa with 15,000 select warriors, initially won victory after victory. His legions captured the city of Tunis, just 30 kilometers from Carthage, and the great power shuddered with horror. However, the Carthaginians hired the Spartan commander Xanthippus, who fundamentally changed the course of the war. Archaeological excavations confirm Polybius's testimony that in the battle at Tunis in 255, the Roman army was practically destroyed. Of 15,000 Romans, only 2,000 people escaped, and Regulus himself was captured. These warriors, accustomed to winning in the tight formation of phalanx, could not withstand elephants and Numidian cavalry on the open plain. And could you have maintained battle order when multi-ton giants with tusks the length of human height charged at you? The rescue expedition under the command of consuls Marcus Aemilius Paulus and Servius Fulvius Nobilior successfully evacuated the remains of the African army. Their fleet of 350 ships defeated the Carthaginian squadron at Cape Hermaeum, capturing 113 enemy vessels. Titus Livius reports that on board, the Roman ships were not only rescued legionnaires, but also thousands of freed prisoners, captured booty, and even war elephants. These overloaded vessels could barely stay afloat. Each quinquereme carried cargo exceeding its normal carrying capacity by almost 2 times. Oars barely turned under the weight, and the decks sagged from human bodies and bales of loot. Can you imagine how the wooden sides of these floating cities creaked from strain? And then struck a catastrophe the equal of which all previous history of navigation had never known. Off the shores of Sicily near Camarina, the Roman Armada was caught by a sudden storm of unprecedented force. Polybius, based on eyewitness accounts, writes that the waves reached the height of a 4-story house, and the wind roared with such force that it tore sails together with masts. The overloaded Roman ships could not maneuver, and one after another capsized or crashed against the rocks. Of 364 warships, only 80 survived. Diodorus Siculus adds that all 300 transport ships with supplies and horses also perished. 100,000 people found death in the abyss in one single night. And would you have dared to trust your life to a wooden vessel in such a storm, knowing that help was nowhere to be expected? The Camarina catastrophe became only the beginning of a chain of maritime tragedies that bled the Roman fleet white. According to Polybius, consuls Marcus Aemilius Paulus and Servius Fulvius Nobilior bore personal responsibility for the death of 100,000 countrymen. The Roman Senate deprived them of the right to triumph and subjected them to public censure. These ships were called Liburnians, fast vessels with one row of oars, borrowed from Illyrian pirates. Imagine wooden ships scattered by a child's hand across a puddle after rain. Exactly so looked the remains of the once formidable armada at dawn after the storm. And could you, being on a sinking ship, have preserved your composure while listening to the death cries of comrades in the icy water? But the Roman Senate, despite the colossal losses, made a decision that stunned contemporaries with its audacity. Just 3 months after the Camarina tragedy, Rome launched 220 new warships. Titus Livius reports that for this all shipyards from Genoa to Tarentum were mobilized, and in the forests of Calabria and Lucania, tens of thousands of woodcutters and carpenters worked. Roman engineers improved the hull construction, making it more resistant to rolling. These vessels were called cataphracts, which meant covered with armor. Like a phoenix risen from ashes, the Roman fleet again covered the expanses of the Mediterranean Sea with its sails. Can you imagine the scale of this industrial feat when in 90 days hundreds of the most complex military machines were created? However, the maritime elements prepared for the Romans a new, even more cruel blow. In 253, the consul Gnaeus Servilius Caepio led a new armada to the shores of Africa. But at Cape Palinurus, he was overtaken by a storm of such force that Polybius compared it to divine punishment. 150 magnificent quinqueremes were swallowed by the abyss together with 30,000 rowers and warriors. Roman sailors called such sudden storms the wrath of Neptune, the sea god who, in their opinion, took revenge for the invasion of land warriors into his domains. Imagine a giant whirlpool sucking wooden ships into its depths like toys. Exactly so saw this catastrophe the few survivors. And would you have had the courage to board a ship again after seeing with your own eyes how the sea turns into a cemetery? But the most terrible was still ahead. A year later broke out the third maritime catastrophe. Off the shores of Lilybaeum perished the fleet of consul Lucius Junius Pullus. Diodorus Siculus writes that of 120 Roman ships, only 30 were saved, and the rest were smashed against rocks during a sudden northwestern storm. These winds were called Mistral, a cold air stream that could reach speeds of 40 meters per second and raise waves up to 10 meters high. Like enraged titans, these waves crashed down on defenseless ships, crushing their sides and masts with thunder that could be heard for tens of kilometers. Would you have dared to entrust your fate to a wooden vessel, knowing that in 23 years of war, the sea had already swallowed 700 Roman ships? And then the Roman Senate made a decision that seemed like an admission of complete defeat. In 249 BCE, the Roman Senate made a decision that contemporaries perceived as an admission of complete defeat: the refusal to build a military fleet. Polybius reports that after the loss of 700 ships in 20 years of war, the Roman treasury was so exhausted that there simply were not enough funds for building new vessels. Each quinquereme cost the state a sum equal to the annual salary of an entire legion, about 200,000 silver denarii. Imagine that over these years riches went to the sea bottom that would have sufficed for maintaining an army of 140,000 men. Senators called the fleet a devourer of gold, an altar on which Rome sacrificed its treasures to the sea god. And could you have convinced the Potter assembly to again spend colossal sums on ships, knowing that previous armadas had become prey to storms? For 7 long years, the Romans conducted a purely land war, besieging the last Carthaginian fortresses in Sicily, Lilybaeum and Drepana. These cities, which the Romans called keys to the island, were true maritime strongholds with impregnable walls and excellently protected harbors. Archaeological excavations in modern Marsala show that Lilybaeum had a double ring of fortifications with towers up to 20 meters high. Roman legionnaires, accustomed to quick victories in open field, stood for years under the walls of these fortresses, bearing enormous losses from diseases and enemy sorties. Like mighty oaks grown with roots into rocky soil, the Carthaginian garrisons held on with the stubbornness of the doomed. Could you have preserved fighting spirit, besieging a fortress 7 years in a row, and seeing how comrades perish from fever and dysentery? But in 242, there occurred an event that fundamentally changed the course of the war. Roman wealthy men voluntarily financed the construction of a new fleet. Titus Livius names these patricians Lucius Cornelius Scipio, Gaius Lutatius Catulus, Quintus Valerius Falto, and other representatives of the noblest families of Rome. Each of them invested personal funds in building 5 to 10 warships with the condition that the state would reimburse expenses only in case of victory. These vessels were built according to a completely new design, without heavy corvices, but with improved seaworthiness. Roman engineers took into account all mistakes of the past and created ships that were called Liburnians, fast and maneuverable vessels modeled on Illyrian pirate galleys. Can you imagine this surge of patriotism when the wealthiest people of the state staked personal fortunes for the sake of common victory? Command of this reborn fleet was taken by Gaius Lutatius Catulus, younger brother of one of the expedition's sponsors. In March 241, his squadron of 200 ships unexpectedly appeared at the Aegates Islands near Drepana and blockaded the last Carthaginian strongholds. Polybius describes the composition of this armada: 150 quinqueremes with improved hull, 30 fast Liburnians for reconnaissance, and 20 heavy hexers, 6-row giants up to 45 meters long. Each ship carried on board a crew of 300 select warriors and sailors who had undergone special training in the calm waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Like a steel chain, Roman ships blocked all sea routes to the besieged cities. And would you have had the resolve at 40 years old to begin studying seamanship from the very basics, knowing that the fate of the entire state depended on this? On the 10th of March 241 BCE at the Aegates Islands was fought the last and most decisive battle of the First Punic War. Polybius describes how at dawn the Carthaginian squadron of 250 ships under the command of Admiral Hanno appeared on the horizon, heading toward besieged Lilybaeum with cargo of food and reinforcements. Roman consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, despite a wound in the thigh received during the assault on Drepana, personally led the attack of his 200 vessels. These ships, created with private funds of Roman patricians, were lighter and faster than previous giants. Engineers rejected heavy corvices and created true sea hunters. Imagine a pack of sea wolves that surround slow prey. Exactly so looked the Roman attack in the eyes of Carthaginian sailors. And could you have preserved composure, commanding a fleet in a battle that would decide the fate of a 2-century confrontation? The Carthaginian ships were overloaded with supplies and carried on board inexperienced crews. Many rowers took oars in their hands for the first time. Diodorus Siculus reports that Hanno was forced to recruit crews from merchants, craftsmen, and even slaves, since experienced sailors had perished in previous battles. The Romans, on the contrary, spent the winter in intensive training. Their rowers perfected synchronization of movements to perfection, and warriors studied the peculiarities of naval combat. Like sharpened blades against rusty daggers, Roman vessels cut into the Carthaginian formation with irresistible force. Philinus of Acragas, a contemporary of the events, writes that Roman ships moved so harmoniously as if controlled by a single will. Could you imagine this thunder of rams piercing sides and the screams of drowning people amid the stormy sea? The battle lasted only a few hours, but its outcome was crushing. 50 Carthaginian ships went to the bottom, 70 were captured together with crews, and only 130 managed to raise sails and retreat to the island of Hira. Polybius indicates the precise number of prisoners: 6,000 Carthaginians, among whom were many noble citizens and military commanders. The Romans lost 30 ships sunk and 50 damaged, but not one of their vessels fell to the enemy. Admiral Hanno, who escaped on one of the surviving ships, upon returning to Carthage, was sentenced to crucifixion for incompetent command. Can you imagine the horror of the Carthaginian Senate when news of the catastrophe reached them, which crossed out 23 years of war? News of the victory at the Aegates Islands reached Rome in 5 days thanks to a system of signal fires created by order of censor Appius Claudius. Titus Livius describes the jubilation of the Roman people. For the first time in a quarter century, citizens could sleep peacefully, not fearing Carthaginian raids on Italian shores. Temples filled with thanksgiving sacrifices, and the people met Consul Lutatius Catulus as a savior of the fatherland. However, the price of this victory was monstrous. According to modern calculations by historian Adolf Holm, during the war, the Roman fleet lost 700 ships, which constituted about 300,000 human lives. And do you realize that this figure exceeds the losses of some states throughout their entire military history? After the victory at the Aegean Islands, Carthage, exhausted by the 23-year war, requested peace on any conditions. Polybius reports that the Carthaginian Senate recalled the last garrisons from Sicily and authorized Commander Hamilcar Barca to conduct negotiations with the Romans. The terms of the peace treaty, signed in 241, were humiliating for the once great maritime power. Carthage lost all of Sicily, paid a tribute of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, and pledged not to attack Roman allies. Each talent weighed about 26 kilograms of pure silver. Imagine a mountain of precious metal the height of a two-story house. This tribute was called stipendium, salary to the victor, which emphasized the humiliating nature of the payments. Could you imagine the bitterness of Carthaginian citizens, who for centuries considered themselves masters of the seas and now had to pay tribute to former land barbarians? But the most important outcome of the war was Rome's transformation into a true maritime power. Titus Livius writes that the Roman fleet, created literally from nothing, by the end of the war surpassed the Carthaginian not only in numbers, but also in quality of shipbuilding. Roman engineers developed revolutionary technologies, watertight bulkheads, improved rams, and a system of signaling between ships using colored flags. These vessels were called naucraries, ship domains, emphasizing that now the sea had become Roman territory on par with land. Like an iron hand stretched over the waves, Roman maritime power squeezed all the Mediterranean in a ring. And do you realize that without these naval victories, there would never have been Caesar's campaigns in Britain, nor Octavian's Egyptian expeditions, nor the great trade routes that linked Europe with Asia and Africa? The tragedy of 700 lost ships taught the Romans harsh lessons that they applied in subsequent wars. Modern research confirms Appian's testimony that after the First Punic War, the Romans created the first naval academy in history on the island of Misenum, where future admirals studied navigation, meteorology, and tactics of naval combat. Archaeological excavations in the Bay of Naples discovered remains of training ships with characteristic traces of multiple repairs, evidence of intensive training. These principles of sailor training, established after the Camarina catastrophe, became the foundation of modern naval academies. Can you imagine the surprise of modern admirals when they learned that the system of naval education used today in Annapolis or St. Petersburg traces back to lessons drawn from Roman shipwrecks 2,000 years ago? The history of 700 lost ships became a warning for all subsequent generations that dominion over the sea is gained only by those who are ready to pay the highest price for it. Diodorus Siculus concludes his account of the First Punic War with words that, "The sea does not forgive mistakes even to great powers." Modern underwater archaeologists continue to find off the shores of Sicily fragments of Roman and Carthaginian ships, mute witnesses of that epoch when the fate of civilization was decided not on battlefields, but in the depths of salt waves. Each discovered fragment of bronze ram or iron anchor reminds us of the price that humanity paid for the right to call the Mediterranean Sea our sea, Mare Nostrum. And have you ever thought that beneath the keel of every modern ship lie the wreckage of ancient vessels, and their crews became unwilling pioneers whose sacrifices paved the sea routes for subsequent generations of seafarers?